Good afternoon, good day, welcome. I'm David Blight, Director of Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. We have a live streaming audience. Hello out there, our loyal GLC audience. We're doing this in our real space. We're breaking the new pattern. During COVID, we started doing all of our Wednesday talks online. It greatly increased the audience because everyone can stay home. But we decided to get back in person, and this case in the center of campus to make it perhaps more accessible to other people. We're thrilled to have Patricia Lott as both our visiting fellow this semester. Patricia has been a warmly welcome participant at the GLC before. She participated in our summer seminar for college instructors under the Legacies of Slavery project we did with the Council of Independent Colleges. I think that was in 2023, I think, yeah. And she was the star of that group for the whole week. Just saw some photos of that this morning, I think on the announcement of your talk. Over at the Lansing statue. See that? That's great. Anyway, Patricia teaches at Ursinus College in Pennsylvania. She has numerous appointments there: African American Studies, Africana Studies, English department. She's a current fellow here, as I said. She did her BA at Dillard in New Orleans, her MA at Berkeley in California, and her PhD at Northwestern, every part of the country. She's held fellowships at the Folger Library, Folger Shakespeare Library, through the Mellon Foundation, a fellowship at Brown, I think John Carter Brown Library, McNeil Center at Penn. She's a public historian as well as a scholar. Her interest, deepest interest, is, as we're about to see, public memory, public collective memory in the North, particularly, of slavery. The title of her talk is the book she's writing, After Ruin, The Crafting of Public Collective Memory of Racial Slavery in the Gradualist North. And most here and in our outside audience will know that most, but not all, of the northern states ended slavery by gradualist plans, not all of them, Vermont, Massachusetts. Various kinds of gradualist plans. There's been a fair amount of writing done about that, but never quite the way that Patricia is doing it. So Patricia, welcome again, and we're delighted to have you, and it's all yours.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking David for that very kind and generous introduction. I'd also like to thank the Macmillan Center and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition for hosting me this semester as I work on completing my book. And last but not least, thank you to all of you who are gathered here today, whether in person or online, to learn more about my work. Without further ado, I present to you After Ruin, Crafting the Public Collective Memory of Racial Slavery in the 19th-Century U.S. Northeast. My presentation on today will proceed thusly. First, I'll give a broad overview of the book manuscript, focusing particularly on its genealogy, its central research problem or question, some of the central lines of argumentation that I take up, the sources that I use to corroborate these lines of argumentation, as well as some key concepts that are important to the book. From there, I'll segue into a discussion of two specific kinds of memory and their associated crafts. The first being legal memory and law craft, and the second being embodied memory and speechcraft. And I offer these two examples just so you can get a sense of the lines of argumentation and the types of analyses that I employ in the book. And after I conclude, we'll leave some time for questions and answers. So to begin. Over the past 4+ decades, publics have witnessed archaeological, architectural, and archival unearthings of racial slavery's past lives in the U.S. North. Some of these unearthings include African burial grounds in New York City and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the remnants of slave quarters at Philadelphia's Executive House that were built at the behest of George Washington when he occupied the house during his tenure as the first president when Philadelphia served as the nation's capital, and the bones of a man named Fortune who lived and labored under the yoke of slavery in 18th century Connecticut. American publics tended to react to these unearthings in three main ways. The first is outright shock. Many persons were unaware of slavery's past lives in the US North, and they were surprised to learn of this history. The other is demands for further evidence, this intellectual curiosity about that history. And the third, admissions of amnesia. Some publics admitted that, yes, at some point in history, we knew about slavery's existence in this particular state, this particular city, et cetera, but somehow, some way over time, that history was forgotten. Similar reactions have arose when prominent colleges and universities in the Northeast began interrogating racial slavery's seminal legacies to their histories, including Brown University, and I was a fellow, David, at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, not the John Carter Brown, just to clarify. Harvard University, we have a book by Craig Stephen Wilder, Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery and the Troubled History of America's Universities, and more recently, Yale and Slavery, written by David Blight. Given the public's reactions to these unearthed remains, I understand them as collectively constituting what I call memory's ruins. That is, once forgotten traces that bear witness both to the lapse in public collective memory of slavery in the US Northeast and to the catastrophic past that this lapse has consigned to oblivion. The central research problem that I take up is how and with what effects have slavery's past lives and afterlives in the US Northeast undergone burial and public collective memory, despite the system's long regional duration and ongoing metamorphoses after formal emancipation. So there are a number of prevailing scholarly accounts of this public collective memory lapse. One argument is that it is an artifact of a white New England imaginary that is as old as the region itself. And Joanne Hope Mellish's book, Disowning Slavery, is representative of this prevailing claim. A second explanation is that it is a consequence of post-Civil War white national reunion, as exemplified by David Blight's Race and Reunion. And a third major explanation is that this memory lapse is a manifestation of white Northern guilt or shame. And this argument is proffered by Mark Howard Ross in his book, Slavery in the North. My book is about the incomplete suppression of the US North slavery past, as illustrated by the protracted struggle between two irreconcilable tendencies among the region's late 18th and 19th century publics, to discard and to preserve the memory of racial slavery. So in my account, the North is not pursuing this one-way course towards oblivion, but there is a struggle between how and whether to remember. So after ruin shows how various individuals and collectives in the region either entombed or exhumed slavery as an unmemorable ghost, depending on their cultural, economic, and socio-political imperatives. The book highlights the power dynamics that shaped this memory work. Okay, so we have different types of public endowed with different kinds and ranges of power. And so I'm interested not only in answering the question of who exercises power, but how it happens, right? And that Foucauldian conceptualization of power. My central argument is that the U.S. North's governing regimes exerted an obliterative force over public collective memory. The word that I use to conceptualize this force is wastecraft, the art and science of laying to waste, especially for self-serving and wicked purposes. I argue that the power of wastecraft collided with the possibility of laying racial slavery to rest, that is, ending the system with finality and engraving the memory of its regional lives and deaths in commemorative cultures. In terms of my research methodology, I employ a critical autopsy of what I call the archive of ruin. And I conceptualize this archive as an accumulation of partially or totally destroyed traces of pasts whose relevance wastecraft has decomposed into oblivion. That's the first instantiation of it. And the second is the official record of the negatory powers and processes that laid waste to public collective memory of racial slavery in the U.S. Northeast. I understand the archive of ruin as a figurative charnel ground that abides within rather than apart from the archive proper. So in terms of sources within the archive of ruin, I look at censored censuses, a once buried book, redacted legal proceedings, and blinding visual images. And I read these sources in relation to those that more conspicuously imprint racial slavery's past lives in the North, including gradual emancipation laws, gallows literature, the print and performance called Abolition, which is a malapropism of abolition, slave narratives, and repertoires for anniversaries like January 1st, which was the formal outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade by Denmark, Great Britain, and the United States, as well as August 1st, or West India Emancipation, which publics in the United States often commemorated. So in terms of the structure of the book, each chapter is organized around a particular kind of memory and an associated technology of wastecraft. These include legal memory and lawcraft, embodied memory and speechcraft, visual memory and eyecraft, emotional memory and housecraft, and state-sanctioned memory and statecraft or statescraft, and its final instantiation. So before I move on to a discussion of legal memory and lawcraft and embodied memory and speechcraft, I just want to say a bit about public collective memory, which is kind of a loaded term. So I want to give a broad overview of what I mean by that. So the book is informed by three main conceptualizations of public. The first is a social totality, as in everyone within a particular field of question. So we could talk about the persons who abide in a particular town, a particular city, or a particular region. A second is a gathering of persons in the same space, place, or location. So if you have a group of people who come to witness a speech, to hear a reading of the Declaration of Independence, that's another type of public. And the third is what Michael Warner would call a discursive public, a public that exists by virtue of being addressed. And the different actors whom I examine in my work address various kinds of public. They may be as generic as fellow countrymen or as specific as sons and daughters of Africa, or the colored citizens of the world, okay? But we see these individuals and collectives addressing various kinds of publics whom they want to take up this problem of racial slavery, incomplete emancipation and unfinished abolition. When I talk about collective, I mean very simply a reciprocity of practice, not consensus or collaboration necessarily, though collective can involve that. But by reciprocity of practice, I mean simply that I'm looking at different persons who are concerned with this problem of the public collective memory of racial slavery. even if they take up opposing positions in that dialectic between the drive to remember and the drive to forget. My understanding of memory is informed by Michel de Certeau, who sees forgetting not as something passive, a loss, but an action directed against the past. So it's willful, it's artful in my conceptualization. And a memory, or the mnemic trace, is the return of what was forgotten and the recognition of the past in the present. Okay, so in my conceptualization, memory doesn't perceive of the past as a foreign country. Okay, it thinks of it more as a familiar, right? A kind of live-in companion. Or in another iteration of the familiar, a constantly, steadily hovering ghost, right? That won't let you forget the past. Let me move now to a discussion of legal memory and lawcraft, and I'll center my discussion here most specifically around the legal enactment of gradual emancipation in the U.S. Northeast. Now, to put legal emancipation in its historical context, I want to talk about two important developments that shape how I think about this process. The first is that in the late 1770s, the revolutionary rhetoric of liberty, taken up by settler colonizers who were seeking independence from Great Britain, is bumping up against the ugly lived realities of racial slavery in the colonies, and then later in the States, post 1776. Okay, and so there's going to be this attempt to address the paradox of these things coexisting as they saw it. At the very same time, in the 1770s and 1780s, judiciaries in the region become increasingly concerned with prosecuting and punishing so-called crimes against property, most especially burglary and theft. And so the 1770s and the 1780s witness not only an increased prosecution of persons for these crimes, but also state execution, state execution and capital punishment for these crimes. So these are developing, again, at the same time. And I'm curious, in the book, I seek to understand the consequences that this historical context has for the legal standing of those who held property and persons, i.e. enslavers, as well as the legal status of persons who were held as property, and whose personhood law recognized primarily to criminalize and to punish, i.e. the enslaved. So the central question or problem that judiciaries are going to try to answer is how could they avoid trespassing upon the property and persons' rights of enslavers, while also entitling the enslaved to their birthrights of life and liberty. And legislatures often try to address this question by framing state-sanctioned emancipation as a compensable crime tantamount to property theft. Okay, so emancipation enacted by anyone other than enslavers themselves, they considered a crime. And so by way of example, in 1796, when New York's legislature gathers to consider and debate the question of emancipation, delegates declared it, quote, unjust and unconstitutional to deprive any citizen or citizens of their property without making them a reasonable compensation. So they saw it as both a moral and a legal wrongdoing, right, to free enslaved people without compensating enslavers. So their primary socioeconomic problems for thought were from whom and how, not whether slaveocrats would receive compensation. And the three groups of persons whom they might have burdened with this compensation were enslavers, taxpayers, and enslaved people. And they shifted almost the entire burden to enslaved people and their children. More specifically, they governed enslaved women's children as a kind of currency to restitute slaveholders for state-sanctioned emancipation. So let me give you a sense of what this would look like. So, as David already pointed out, various northern legislatures enacted emancipation in an uneven, but also in some ways consistent manner. So Massachusetts didn't pass a gradual emancipation law, and most scholars point to its 1783 constitutional clause declaring all men free and equal as the state's statement on emancipation and for the abolition of slavery. But that generic natural rights discourse only aided in the emancipation of enslaved people through subsequent judicial interpretations. In other words, enslaved people brought freedom suits before courts in Massachusetts to gain their freedom by citing the 1783 Constitution. Okay, so it's not the Constitution itself that's freeing them. Likewise, we have New Hampshire in 1783. Its constitution, again, doesn't make any mention of slaves, slavery, abolition, or emancipation, but it has this generic natural rights discourse. And many scholars point to the state's 1857 personal liberty law, passed in reaction to the Fugitive Slave Clause of 1850 as the state's final death knell to the institution of racial slavery in the state. Here we have different states legislating emancipation with age and sex stipulations. So Connecticut, for example, its 1784 law legislated that enslaved women's children could become free when they turned 25. It outright abolished the practice of slavery in 1848. New Jersey passed a law in 1804 stipulating that enslaved women's children could become free at 21 if female and 25 if male. And slavery was not formally abolished in that state until 1865 with the 13th Amendment. And we see different age stipulations for New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Vermont as well. And it's important to note that despite all of these temporal differences and wordings of laws, one of the most distinct features of the Northern emancipation process is that it did not free a single slave. Okay, the laws and the constitutions themselves did not. It's only, again, through freedom suits that enslaved people are able to acquire emancipation, or enslaved women's children if they don't die first, or enslavers don't retain them to settle debts or sell them out of state, perhaps to the South, perhaps to the Caribbean, that they might possibly acquire freedom when they reach these ages. Okay, so the logic behind this gradual emancipation process is evident in an 1817 letter that Governor Tompkins wrote to New York State's legislature. And he writes that most colored persons born previous to the 4th of July, 1799, the date of New York's first gradual emancipation law, will have become of very little value to their owners. Indeed, many of them will by that time have become an expensive burden. To fix a day thus remote for general emancipation, the 4th of July, 1827, he argues, would consequently impair at a very small degree any private right of enslavers, and would at the same time be consistent with the humanity and justice of a free and prosperous people. So here we see again this attempt to protect the property and persons' rights of slaveholders while also legislating emancipation. And it's important to point out here that the way that he frames prospective ex-slaves thinks of them first and foremost as property, right? He talks about their use value and how by the time they reach the ages stipulated by the law or beyond, they'll actually have little value to their owners, and in fact, will cost enslavers more money, so that they might as well free them. And in his estimation, this type of scheme would be consistent with the humanity and justice of a free and prosperous people. So I'm interested in thinking about these developments in terms of legal memory. And it's important to point out that during the period that these developments are taking place, you have various Northern legislators and members of the public who are arguing that their state was the first to free enslaved people or to legislate the abolition of slavery. So Vermont, for example, with its 1777 constitutions, claims that it's the first. But then in 1790, when the first U.S. census comes out, You have people in Massachusetts who are saying, not so fast. We're the only state in the Union that did not have any enslaved people recorded in our census, so we're the first, right? So you have this contest for primacy. And scholars, beginning in 1967 with author Zilber Smith's book, The First Emancipation, have inherited this master narrative of gradual emancipation in the North, that the North set the precedent for emancipation that would be followed by the second emancipation of the 13th Amendment. But here I want to think about the question of precedent in a different way. And we see how legal memory manifests in the doctrine of standing by things decided, which holds that the past is supposed to govern the present. And in my estimation, the slavery past governed how legislatures enacted emancipation in their 18th and 19th century present. So here I want to think about gradualism as lawcraft, by which I mean sly use of the law's ambidexterity and giving with one hand what it takes with the other, and in the process bearing false witness before the court of public opinion about this double dealing. And I argue that lawcraft cloaked gradualism's legal reconfiguration of the enslaver-enslaved relation as emancipation. Now, to further this argument, I'll just say a few words about the various meanings that slavery holds, including the negation or severe limitation of free will, involuntary servitude, restricted personal liberty, confined liberty of contract, coerced and expropriated labor used in the service of capitalist accumulation, social death or natal alienation, violent domination, and general degradation, property and commodified and fungible persons, civil death or loss or deprivation of the right to have citizenship rights, and the subjugation of strangers. So we have these varied meanings of slavery. And on top of that, the modern colonial world also practiced racial slavery, race being a political category of governance that originated with European colonialism and slavery. And under this system, Black was the racial designation for the category of persons condemned to slavery, especially if they were born to enslaved mothers. Under the principle child follows belly. And so racial slavery then was a racialized relation of domination predicated upon Black enslavement by white people. And so what's important to know here is that gradualism is not tackling slavery in its broad and complex manifestations. What it mostly argues is that slavery should not be slavery for life, but should have term limits set on it. And so we see a critique of the insufficiency of gradual emancipation coming most forcefully from formerly enslaved people or the descendants of enslaved people. And so I read persons like Jose Easton in his treatise on the intellectual character of the civil and political condition of the colored people of the United States, Sojourner Truth's narrative of Sojourner Truth, a northern slave emancipated from bodily servitude by the state of New York, as well as Life of James Mars, a slave born and sold in Connecticut by James Mars, to explore the various machinations by which enslavers and states conspired to keep enslaved women's children in slavery beyond the set terms specified by the law. And so these texts, I argue, bear witness to the crimes of slavery and how law gave slavocrats and their co-conspirators immunity from these grave offenses. They also expose gradualism as a patently unliberatory scheme, deceptively framed as a triumph of liberty. And they elucidate how gradualism inherits key features of racial slavery, including matrilineal assignation, the chattel principle viewing enslaved people as property, the penal logic that it's enslaved people and their children who should pay the so-called criminal debt owed to enslavers for the crime of emancipation, and the profit motive, right? These are what are driving the gradualist process. And so we have, for example, Jose Easton in his treatise arguing for immediate emancipation and abolition rather than gradualism. And he argues that the doctrine of immediate abolition embraces the idea that the emancipated must be placed back where slavery found them and restore to them all that slavery has taken away from them. Merely to cease beating the colored people and leave them in their gore and call it emancipation is nonsense. Nothing short of an entire reversal of the slave system in theory and practice, in general and in particular, will ever accomplish the work of redeeming the colored people of this country from their present condition. Let the country then no longer act the part of the thief. Let the free states no longer leave the colored people half dead, and so call it emancipation. So in my reconsideration of gradualism as a form of lawcraft, I rethink this narrative of Northern exceptionalism as the first emancipator. And I recontextualize lawcraft in the U.S. Northeast within broader national and circum-Atlantic histories. And I'm thinking here of the second emancipation effected by the 13th Amendment, which had some key features in common with the so-called first emancipation. For example, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery except as punishment for a crime. And you can find in the letter of some constitutions and emancipation laws in the North, including Vermont, that slavery is abolished except as punishment for a crime. The gradual emancipation process in South America occurred along a similar logic of state-sanctioned emancipation being a compensable crime. I'm thinking here of the apprenticeship system in the British West Indies, which stipulated that enslaved people would have to labor for 6 years after the act passed for their enslavers, as well as Britain's taxpayer-funded compensation to West Indian enslavers after the nation's 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. And they took out a loan to pay this debt, which the government did not pay off until, I think it was 2015, all right? As well as France's coercion of independence debts from Haiti. Right, so I'm rethinking gradualism within this broader context, rather than within this narrative of Northern exceptionalism. And ultimately, what I do is reconsider gradualist laws in the U.S. Northeast as part of a broader global scheme that endowed the enslaved with a bankrupted emancipation, which is to say, a patently unliberatory emancipation that also saddled the enslaved and their progeny with this debt to pay back, whether in physical compensation or through their bodies, skills, and labor. So the second type of memory and its associated craft that I'll discuss is embodied memory and speechcraft. And so I look at public commemorations of various anniversaries of the abolition of the slave trade and of slavery. They're outlawing in the U.S. Northeast, including January 1st of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, July 5th, which was the day that Black people in New York chose to mark gradual emancipation because, as various historians argue, July 4th was too dangerous. July 14th, the day that Black people in Boston chose to commemorate the abolition of the slave trade, and August 1st, the West India Emancipation Day. And I examined these public commemorations as battlegrounds of embodied memory for Black observers and Blacks and white pro-slavery spectators. And by embodied memory, I mean corporeal acts, gestures, performances, orality, dancing, singing, etc., that recognize, recall, or reproduce the past and the present. So in terms of historical and rhetorical context for thinking about these public commemorations, they're taking place during what scholars would call the golden age of American oratory, or the great age of American eloquence. Eloquence being the verbal art of articulating fluent, appropriate, and persuasive rhetoric to appeal to listeners logically, rouse them conscientiously, and awe them stylistically. And within this context, eloquence was power. And so if you could wield that verbal art towards these ends specified here, that was a particular manifestation of power that one could use in the service of their political objectives. Moreover, this era overlaps with what scholars would call the age of emancipation and the age of revolution. And so there's a circumatlantic orientation to US-based commemorative occasions. And for Black observers in particular, the Haitian Revolution and Britain's Slavery Abolition Act are two major developments in the circumatlantic that are informing what they do during these occasions. So between 1808 and the mid to late 1860s, Black observers publicly staged a prolific culture of commemoration regarding the transatlantic slave trade, racial slavery, and their formal outlawing. And they used these occasions for memory, mourning, and mobilization. Most often, they would commemorate the memory of their ancestral homeland, Africa, as well as the mother loss that ensued as a result of them being taken captive through the transatlantic slave trade. They often would mourn gradualism as a missed opportunity to enact emancipation and abolition, but they would also mobilize politically in an attempt to bring slavery to a close. And during these occasions, they used oratorical eloquence to reiterate their natural rights, breathe life into gradual emancipation's half-dead legal letter, and lay racial slavery to rest. And so Black observers' attitudes towards oratory are perhaps best expressed by William Grant Allen in his speech Orators and Oratories. And he argues that orations worthy of the name must have for their subject personal or political liberty, and orators worthy of the name must necessarily originate in the nation that is on the eve of passing from a state of slavery into freedom, or from a state of freedom into slavery. And because of this, he argues that African-American orators, people like Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, are poised to develop oratorical art to its highest capacities, given the fact that they were in a transition state from freedom to slavery. And he argues of oratorical eloquence, by the exercise of this weapon, perhaps more than any other, America was to be made a free land, not in name only, but in deed and in truth. So they put a lot of stock in their ability to do things with words, to borrow from the title of the book by J.L. Austin about the power of performativity, or the power of words to accomplish the very deeds to which they refer, when uttered by authorized speakers in specific situations. And because they considered gradualism a halfway measure that left the enslaved and their descendants half dead, in the words of Easton, they often pointed to more immediate enactments of emancipation. So for example, in this speech for the address in commemoration of the Great Jubilee of the 1st of August, 1833, the speech writers laud English, Irish, and Scottish abolitionists achieving emancipation in the British West Indies by talking, writing, printing, picturing, and petitioning against slavery year after year until they gained it, right? So to reiterate emancipation, to reiterate abolition until they achieved it through these various types of speech and writing. And they implored their audience to preach the Declaration of Independence till it begins to be put into practice. So they believed that 1776 was an unfinished revolution so long as racial slavery lived on. And they implored their listeners to preach the Declaration until America lived up to its promise. And so these Black observers had a central arch nemesis in abolitionists. Abolition being a caricatural print performance culture that originated in Boston and that circulated beginning in the mid-1810s through the mid to late 1830s. And this print and performance culture arose in direct contestation of gradual emancipation in the North. And so we see three different types of genres of abolition: revelries, which burlesque the performance rights and rhetoric of Black observers; replies that unflatteringly impersonate Black letter writers; and riots, which absurdly depict scenes of both real and fantasized white mob violence against Black residents. And abolition is a cultural forebear of Blackface minstrelsy. The form consists mostly of poetry, dialogues, letters, speeches, toasts, songs, and non sequiturs printed in malapropic type. And some of the prints did contain vignettes or images, usually at the top. And in later instantiations, like in the Life in Philadelphia series, it takes on a colored manifestation or prints in color. In addition to being prints, Abolition was a performance piece of a sort, as the intended humor is evident only when they are read aloud. And according to Phil Lepsansky, abolitionists may have interrupted Black-led commemorative ceremonies to enact their pieces. So it's not just a print that they circulated, but also a performance culture. And so abolition often ridiculed prominent African-American mutual aid, moral reform, and abolition societies in the Northeast. And they also frequently mocked Phyllis Wheatley, deemed by many the founding mother of the African-American literary tradition. So here is one example of a abolition broadside, splendid celebration of the abolition of slavery, which has a vignette of a marching unit of Black male figures marching in pairs of two down a cobblestone street in military dress. And underneath the vignette are 3 columns of print text, which is a mock letter sent by the fake president of the African Society, Samuel Smash Pipes, to give the order of celebration that's supposed to occur for their abolition celebration. And here is an example of one of several abolition broadsides that mocked Phyllis Wheatley, Dreadful Riot on Negro Hill. Negro Hill being the nickname given by many Bostonians to the area where most African Americans lived during the era. And so you have here in a figure a group of white male figures who are wielding brickbats and throwing stones, and this Black female figure who's poised with a broom ready to swat them. And as you go on to read the broadside through the 3 columns of text, below, the letter purports to be by one Phyllis to her sister in the country, and numerous references to Alexander Pope, to John Milton, to a mahogany desk, and to the sublime all signify that this Phyllis is supposed to be Phyllis Wheatley. So I consider abolition an instantiation of what I call speechcraft. And abolitionists as speech crafters are semiotic magicians skilled in the art and science of using speech for cunning, deception, guile, or trickery. And I argue that abolitionists stealthily weaponize nonsense as a powerful semiotic ploy with sharp political teeth that chewed up and spat out Black eloquence as drivel in order to perpetuate slaveocracy, while veiling this perpetuation with nonsensicality. Right? So it's in direct contestation to the oratorical eloquence of Black observers or to the literary eloquence of Black writers like Phyllis Wheatley that abolitionists are doing this print and performance culture. The pro-slavery print and performance culture that abolition originated, I argue, eventually shed its original regionalist skin for a new cover and for another kind of wicked scheme. As I stated before, abolition was a cultural forebear to blackface minstrelsy. And it's interesting to note that as abolition paved the path for blackface minstrelsy, white performers slyly swapped its northeastern and western roots for a southern origin story. Okay, so if you look at the earlier broadsides that I showed you examples of, they are set in decidedly northeastern settings, okay, Massachusetts, specifically Boston, and they mock real figures in the Northeast, Phyllis Wheatley, the African Mutual Aid Society of Boston, etc. It's interesting to note that even though some blackface performers cited abolition as an inspiration for their own performances, later in from the mid-19th century up through the late 19th century, they began to articulate it not as this national sort of performance art, but rather as a distinctly Southern one. And we see this most explicitly with Thomas Dartmouth Rice, known as the father of blackface minstrelsy. and I consider him a grandsire of speechcraft. And his speechcrafting is most discernible in an 1837 curtain speech that he gave at Baltimore's Holiday Street Theater. And in this speech, he claims that his Jim Crow Act effectually proved that Negroes are essentially an inferior species of the human family, and they ought to remain slaves, therefore showing the pro-slavery impetus of minstrelsy. And he alleges that he acquired this proof by studying the Negro character upon the Southern plantations. However, as scholars like Eric Lott have pointed out, the minstrel show most often glossed not white encounters with life on the plantation, but racial contacts and tensions endemic to the North and the frontier. And Rice developed his Jim Crow Act in Northwestern cities like Cincinnati, Louisville, and Pittsburgh. And as Douglas Jones points out, Rice's time in what was then the West marks how the cultural world of the frontier also contributed to the early minstrelsy's performative vocabularies and parabolic structures. So given Rice's speech crafting, his curtain speechcraft cites the plantation South as the sole proving ground for his thesis on Black inferiority and the singular inspirational playground for his Blackface Minstrelsy Act. As a result, I argue that his speechcrafting indexes Blackface minstrelsy as a dress rehearsal for exonerating the North and scapegoating the South for the crimes of racial slavery post-Civil War. So to conclude, I'll just sketch two main objectives that I have in writing this book. And the first is to illuminate wastecraft's centrality to the making, meaning, and memory of the U.S. North, as well as to articulate how wastecraft has limited the kind and range of critical sensibilities, cultural practices, and politics that people take up in the after effects of such a catastrophic history. That concludes my presentation for today, and I'd like to now hear your questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Patricia. Assume the mics are okay.
Hello, hello. Yes.
Here and up there. I have a number of questions, but I want to open it to the floor first, please. Anyone? Yes, Ella.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. That was such a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I'm really curious about kind of the methodology that you're bringing to this project, and I'd love to know how you came up with the craft framework.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It was really through just sitting with my materials and looking at the language that various individuals and collective use to describe either what they were doing or what they observed other individuals and collectives doing in relationship to the public collective memory of racial slavery. And so I'm thinking here in particular about a speech given in Philadelphia. I think it was sometime in the 1830s by Black abolitionist Joseph M. Core. And he talks about the various machinations by which pro-slavery white publics in Philadelphia particularly sought to keep what he called the quote unquote magic power of slavery alive, right? And he talks about this using the language of magic as a kind of witchcraft, right? As a kind of sorcery. I'm also thinking about Hosea Easton's treatise, which I cited here, and his critique, for example, of various caricatural images that he's witnessing across New England, Massachusetts particularly, which is where he was born. And he talks about how these cuts and placards are marked by a broken I think he calls it a broken lingo that is marked with a distinct design, whose main purpose is to show that Black people are only slaves and underlings who are only fit for servitude. And so again, there's that language of sort of this sorcery, this deception, this deceit. And so it was really in sitting with that, and there are other numerous examples I could cite, but those are the two that come most prominently to mind, that I wanted to think about craft in that more pernicious manifestation as sort of this guile, this trickery, this deceit. But there's also another iteration of craft that we can think about just in its general sense as skill, right? And if we think about Black orators and oratorical eloquence, they considered oratory, a craft, right? They took it very seriously. They, spent time thinking a lot about how to write and how to stage speeches for maximum effect. They thought a lot about how to order their ceremonies for maximum public participation, for maximum political capital. So that's where the craft comes in.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for your question.
Michelle.
I would think that part of that also is just your, I can't remember what disciplines your degrees are in. I know one of your appointments at Ursinus is in the English department.
Mm-hmm.
So I just really appreciate your attention to language, rhetoric, and the mechanics of that. It just seems an essential tool for kind of unpacking these issues.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for that.
As somebody with a BA in literature, I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for noticing that. And yes, I try to really sit with each instantiation of memory and its associated craft. And when I did my book manuscript workshop back in June, I think it was, at the Folger, one of the reviewers, Jasmine Nicole Cobb, she described me and herself as devoutly interdisciplinary. So thank you for picking up on that and noticing the attention. Yes, so I am too, crafting, right?
Yeah.
Devoutly, is there a place you have to go to worship? I don't know. I'm just kidding. Others, please. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, so this is, so I really enjoyed the presentation. Sounds, I look forward to the book.
Thank you.
So this is more of a comment on some of the history that's behind this crafting of racism, really, what you're describing. And that one thing that's missing is the one good thing that did come out of gradual emancipation in the North, and that's the emergence of these Black communities.
Okay.
Which weren't really there. I mean, there was Black people there, but they did not have the freedom, quite literally, to come together and form communities and begin to establish themselves with a place in the United States, in American society. And what you're describing really reminds me of some of the work of Jim Stork.
I'm sorry, what?
James Brewer Stork. Very important article that he wrote in the late 90s about the hardening of race relations that follows emancipation.
Yeah, Mellish makes that same argument as well.
Yeah, it's really important. And because the same thing happens after the second emancipation, right? The rise of lynchings, the terror in the American South, all of that follows abolition, right? It follows and a very similar dynamic had taken place in the North already. And this critique of, I love the way that you frame this critique of gradualism within the context of in the aftermath of those gradualism in the North. But it's super important, I think, to remember that it's the emergence of these Black communities that enables this critique to come forth, right? If they had not been there, it's doubtful that white abolitionist communities on their own would have come up with this.
That they would come up with
these critiques of gradualism in the same manner, in the same depth.
Oh, yeah.
That emerges in the antebellum North.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So So part of when I talk about how the processes of crafting that I'm examining are central to the making, meaning, and memory of the U.S. North. I'm talking about that in various manifestations, including the formation of what some scholar, I think it's Joanna Brooks, would call a Black counterpublic. So I do get into that, particularly in the final chapter, where I'm talking more about, once we reach the end of the 19th century, you began to see really how in the beginning of, well, let me go back to the late 18th, early 19th century, the North did not necessarily think of itself as the North as such, right? And how it's really through this process.
No North until there's the South.
Right, but it's also through this process of the public collective memory and forgetting of slavery, right? That the North's constitution of the North as such, right, begins to concretize. And for me, I think the formation of Black counterpublics who, dissent against being governed by the machinations of wastecraft is central to that, right? Which I talk about in the last chapter. And I always, I was just reading or rereading Mellish the other day, and I'll have to think more about this phrase, the hardening of racial lines. I think it's the hardening that I really find kind of sticky. And I'm not sure if that's the word, that's not necessarily the word that I would use. For me, as I pointed out, slavery was racial slavery, right? And so the development of race as a political category of governance is definitely the solidification of a type of racial line, right? That says that, to be Black is to be a slave. And so I guess what I'm thinking about is, I guess, not necessarily a hardening, but a reconfiguration. Because, yes, there is a white lash, so to speak, to both gradual emancipation and to the 13th Amendment that's marked by profound violence. But slavery itself was so constitutively violent that I'm not sure if it's a matter of degrees so much as sort of the manifestations, the particular technologies and methodologies of violence that people use. But thank you for your question. I'll have to think about that hardening of racial lines some more. But that word often is so sticky to me. Yeah, thank you.
Patricia, let me too honor your enormous skill at ferreting out this story about language and ideas from a wide array of sources. Thank you for bringing Hosea Easton back. And Hosea Easton's narrative being one of the earliest is too often forgotten. That was 1838,
1837.
It's there before all those narratives come along, like Douglas's in the 40s and 50s. And it's a compelling narrative, say that quote you have.
Yeah.
Woo. And then there's so many powerful ideas at stake here. Property. Good God, property. From day one, for any kind of abolition, was the problem. Because it's legal. And even James Madison says there can never be property in man, as he's still a slaveholder crafting the Constitution. I do want to ask you though, but I think you said, I have a couple other thoughts too. I think you said that no gradual plan, not a single gradual plan freed a single slave. Now, in New York, for example, 1827, the law finally goes into effect. James McCune Smith, Samuel Ringgold Ward, a lot of those guys that were educated at the African Free School, they did get their legal freedom. They were born slaves.
Right.
But they got their legal freedom by 1827. Card carrying, so to speak. They didn't get it through a freedom suit. So I just want you to clarify that, because these gradual plans, repulsive as they were and are, did eventually free people if you got to be old enough. So explain, if not a single gradual plan freed a single slave, that's not really true, is it?
Okay, so
Go ahead.
so let me clarify then that at the moment of their enactment.
Oh, at the moment of their,
So when you look at,
that makes, that's a
so
big
New
difference.
York's
Okay.
first gradual emancipation
yeah.
law is 1799.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
you gotta be 21.
And right.
In Connecticut
Male
was
and
21 for
25.
men, 25.
Oh, no, it was 25 for everyone in Connecticut.
25 for everyone, that's right.
And so what I'm trying to get at here is that, okay, so there are different categories of persons that gradual emancipation law is governing.
Yeah.
The first would be what we call antenati, or those born before the law's dates of enactment.
Right.
Okay, and so for them, gradual emancipation was a non-event, right?
Or disappointing.
It did not make, right, provision for them to be free.
No, deeply disappointing.
Okay.
Yeah.
For enslaved women's children born on or after the day of enactment,
Right.
gradualism stipulated that they could be free when or if they reach the age of majority specified by the law, right? So it's not, it delays emancipation.
Right. Okay.
And for some, it's never realized because again, they may die before its enactment, right? If you think about, for example, the state of Pennsylvania, the age of 28, right, in a colony, right, where the age of mortality for most enslaved people, I think Gary Nash in Freedom by Degrees puts it at age 21.
Average life
Expectancy, right? Or, they could have been sold into slavery in the South of the Caribbean, or they could have been retained to pay for debts, right? So if you look at the letter of Vermont's law, it states that, no slave should be held beyond the age of 21 if female, I think it's 18 if female, 21 if male, unless, right, they have incurred particular debts that enslavers can keep them in enslavement for. So it's the moment of that.
Right. No, I understand. I didn't hear it right.
Okay, no.
I mean, also, you never mention it because you don't really need to, but the whole colonization movement.
Oh, I do. I talk
Oh,
about
you do in your book. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
The whole colonization movement comes out of this. Comes out of that gradualism.
Yes.
Of the whole, Jeffersonian mentality of the teens.
Yes.
And it has an enormous and beguiling effect.
Yes.
People. This is going to be the method now. Voluntary colonization, which was itself gradual. Also, this is all happening, maybe you know this in the book, during this period of an increasingly virulent racial science.
Oh, yeah.
Scientific racism. It really is catching on in the 20s and 30s as these gradual plans. And I don't, Reginald Horseman, there have been books on this, but I really wonder, have somebody really examined this in terms of how that supported gradualism? How that sustained gradualism? It certainly sustained colonization. You had to rid the country of these people because a biracial society was deemed impossible.
We have a couple of online questions.
Oh, we do, great, okay. To the online audience.
So many compliments. In
Oh,
the
thank
chat.
you. Thank you so
Wonderful
much.
talk, including from Lois McMillan, friend of the GLC, who's a teacher out in
Hi,
Oregon.
Lois.
She's a teacher in Oregon who often watches the GLC at lunch presentations with her class.
Nice.
And she said that she wants me to tell you that her students are blown away by your talk.
Oh, thank you, Lois and
They're probably
students.
cheering right now.
Oh, thank you.
Wherever.
And many people are.
Eastern Oregon, actually.
Many people are looking forward to getting your book.
So am I.
So a question, considering how recent some of this history is, for example, Britain completing its loan payment in 2015. What are some of the current day stakes of learning and contending with the legal and cultural crafts that you analyze? What lessons can we take away for today?
So thank you for that question. I'll just actually go with the example provided in the question of reparation, right? So historically, I just traced a history of compensation for state-sanctioned emancipation, compensation in this case being given to enslavers and not the enslaved. And more contemporarily, the question of reparation for enslaved people's descendants is what occupies most of the public conversation. And for me, I think that what a lot of these debates often don't contend with is that earlier moment in which you have emancipation itself being framed as a kind of criminal injury to slaveholders for which they require compensation. And I think that burden, as I argue in the book, when I flesh out the consequences of this, what it essentially does is says that slaveholders are the injured party, not the enslaved. And that this conspiracy of global racial capitalism, as I call it, what it in effect does is says that the enslaved and their descendants are irreparable for the crimes of slavery, right? That's the power dynamic that it's setting up. And that in fact, former slaves and former slave colonies themselves become indebted to, right? Former colonizers and former enslavers for emancipation, this independence debt in the case of Haiti. And so I don't think that I can understate what I see as the importance of having to grapple with that legacy, how it sort of burdens contemporary conversations about reparations in ways that people have yet to consider. So that's just one major thing that I would think about. Another important thing, I think contemporarily, the fact that race is still one of the most salient political categories of governance, both in the United States and globally, is something that I think we should not just easily skirt past or dismiss, particularly given the fact that it emerged during European colonialism and racial slavery. And, you know, if its main purpose during that era was to distinguish the category of persons who were enslavable from different categories of persons who could enslave, how does that baggage still repeat in the present? So those would just be two prominent examples that I would give.
No,
Yeah, there's
one more.
So someone is wondering whether in your book you consider how historians of that time and sense are in the business of crafting memory in relation to this history, and how far this replicates other crafting from the areas you outlined today or challenges it. And somebody else, when is the book going to be available?
You wish you knew, right?
So, yes, I wish I knew, but I'll answer the first question about how historians are in the business of crafting according to those various technologies of wastecraft, both historically during the era that I examined, right, as well as in the present, I think was the question. Okay, so as concerns the first, there are a number of antiquarian histories written by lay historians in the late 18th and the 19th century about slavery in the North that I address in the book. And very often you have them portraying racial slavery as this sort of benign and benevolent institution in New England, you know, that really, you know, didn't involve that many slaves, right? That had kind masters and that was over with pretty quickly, right? That's the story that they tend to paint of slavery in the North. And I'm thinking here, for example, I think it's John Fanning's Annals of Philadelphia. I'm thinking there's another one I was just recently looking at in relationship to Vermont. But yes, absolutely, I do look at antiquarian historians, also Black historians of the era, people like William Cooper Nell, right? And the way that they are thinking about how to write what Henry Highland Garnet calls a history of ruin, right? Which he considers slavery, a history of ruin. And so Black historians like William Cooper Nell, as well as Black orators like Henry Highland Garnet are concerned with this question. In terms of contemporary historians, my thinking here is partially informed by Nathan Huggins and his argument in The Deforming Mirror of Truth. Yes.
All praise to Nathan Huggins.
I know. And what he argues is that.
Let's do a seminar just now.
Oh, yes, please. He argues that America's founding fathers, that in their framing of the Constitution and their framing of the Declaration, they crafted what he calls a master narrative of American history, a master narrative being one that commands how we think about the past. And he argues that in this narrative, they present the story of the United States as the development of the North, Red Puritan New England.
Nathan would have known, he was trained by Oscar Handlin.
Oh, yeah, yep. Minus any consideration of slavery, the conspicuous fact of racial slavery, as he called it. And so it wrote the history as one of freedom and free institutions, of white people unengaged with Black people, and as dissemination of democracy to the broadest possible public. And he argues that American historians conspired with the founding fathers to promote this master narrative. And so he states that this was the case largely up until the 1960s, when you began to see professional historians take up these questions of slavery in the North in a different kind of way. People like Lorenzo Green, you mentioned Oscar Handlin, Edmund Morgan, thank you, who argues that American freedom is itself the creation of racial slavery. And so I, engage with many historians in the book who, take this master narrative to task. So that's
Yeah, for those listening out there anywhere, the book Patricia is actually quoting from is called Black Odyssey. It was a little Bible for some of us at one point. Anyway, we're running out of time, but I wanted to just stress too that your use of wastecraft, lawcraft, speechcraft, statecraft, and the kinds of memory. When I started out in memory studies, so-called, I didn't know what I was doing.
No.
And most people didn't. We were fumbling around trying to follow anthropologists and one or two historians who were doing it, mostly French. And I can remember times in the 90s when I was working on Race and Reunion, I would start using terms like political memory and legal memory and rhetorical memory, and people would say, bosh, memory's biological.
No.
Well, not entirely.
Yes.
We had to go through all of this endless fighting about what was the proper language
Yes.
for this. And I guess I'm just saying it's a good thing that you're in a time now. Of course, you come out of the world of English literature,
Yes.
but in a time now when we're much more fluid about this,
Yes.
interdisciplinary, if you like, freer to talk about. Because I faced some social historians in those years that said, this is just bosh.
Yeah.
You don't know what memory is. It's biological. It's up here on this side of the brain, or was it this side? And it can't be this social thing, this collective thing. And then you had to keep pointing out that people have been writing about collective memory since Aristotle, or longer, maybe, sometimes on walls. Anyway, everybody does it. So, I mean, it's interesting that we're now in a stage when memory gets its own language.
Yes.
Over and over and over.
Yes.
Anyway, this is a very important topic. and the historical memory in the North. And I would just point out too, you know this, in our book on Yale and slavery, we created one of our interludes, which between chapters is a section on the 1884 Connecticut gradual plan
Yes.
and how Black folk responded to it. It was so, I mean, there they were in the midst of the revolution, or at the end of the revolution, or the New York law, which comes later. And they're inspired by this revolutionary ideology. Hundreds, actually more than hundreds, are in the Revolutionary Army. And then the states come out with these gradual plans to say your children will be free in 21 years, 25 years. It had this marker, for these Black communities. It had to be resisted. It had to be somehow tolerated to survive. But it became the thing it seems to have become the thing against which communities define themselves. They've done this, but despite that, we're going to build something. We're going to create something. Which has always been the story. But these plans were real markers. They were creating memory of that marker at that very time.
Right. And I think that's also why the circumatlantic component is important. Because, for example, you mentioned, I think approximately 5,000 Black soldiers fought on the side of the colonies for the American Revolutionary War, but 20,000 fought on the side of the British.
Right. Yeah.
And why is it, right, that...
Or Dunmore's proclamation.
Right, and when gradualism begins to take hold, you have Black observers looking across the circumatlantic to more immediatist enactments of emancipation as models, because they see gradualism as a failure.
Absolutely.
And so I think that in addition to that local community making, there's also this circumatlantic community making that I definitely want to underscore in the book.
Immediatism was built on the failure of gradualism. I mean, William Lloyd Garrison was the gradualist for a minute or two, or a year or two.
And pro-colonization.
And pro-colonization until he
came to his senses.
found himself in jail in Baltimore and thought, no, these are bad ideas. Any last thought? Anybody in the room or out there in heaven or wherever you are? Well, Patricia, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Stick around.
It's been a pleasure. I will.
Okay. Thank you.